name's Vindow, and I'll be doing a video series for iPoker VIP. A little background on myself: I've been playing poker since about 2007, but I didn't really get too serious with it until 2009. I played mid-stakes on the major sites like Full Tilt and Poker Stars up until Black Friday, where Full Tilt got shut down, and have just been grinding it back up on other sites since, mostly on Party Poker these days. The majority of my time has been spent playing 6 max no limit hold'em, but I have spent some time playing heads up no limit as well. I basically don't play quite as much heads up anymore because just getting action was a pain, and I didn't like to wait to get action. I also work a full-time job, so I can't sit around all day and just wait for people to sit with me. My style approach to the game is maybe a little different than most. When I first started playing, I used a lot of Poker Tracker 2 stats, maybe Hold'em Manager stats, to try to determine a lot of my decisions against my opponents, purely from statistics, which works out for a while, and it still works, but it's important to be able to add other components into your game. Over time, I eventually started to add a feel element into my game, especially when playing heads up, to help make decisions that were more psychologically based and not always determined by statistics. Overall, I'm a really analytical and detail-oriented player, and you'll see that in my slides. They're very detailed, and I actually had to leave out some information because the slides were just getting too full. I love to talk about poker, so thanks to iPoker VIP for this opportunity to share with some of the knowledge that I've learned. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking about how to exploit today's small stakes regulars in 6 max no limit games. Generally, my take on live videos is that they're good so that you can see what goes on in a player's mind while they're playing, but I feel like they tend to lack detail because you can't capture all of the concepts in one video, because obviously a 4 or 6 tabling video is only going to get so much action at one time. I believe that hand history reviews combined with theory discussion is probably the most effective way for a newer player to improve their game. So in this video, I'll be talking about mostly flop play, and in this series I plan to be covering all 3 streets in great detail, because I feel like even in today's theory videos, there are a lot of details that are left out due to time constraints and whatnot. However, I think that if someone really wants to improve their game, they need to spend a lot of time and going into detail about every aspect of each street of the game. A few notes on this video. You'll see that I won't really go over specific numbers on any statistics in this video, because I think that each player will have different statistics, and you can't draw pure conclusions on a certain number. For example, like 2 players can have flop C bets of 75%, but it could mean completely different things, where one player just might have a ton of bluffs and the other player might have a ton of thin value. Anyways, we'll talk about that later. Most examples that I'll be using will refer to hero holding air type hands, but it's important to know how to use both your air and made hands in your range for optimal decision making. I think the biggest leak today that you guys will see, and I mean you guys might find this amongst yourselves as well, is that people at the tables do things that they see in videos or have been told to do, but never really knowing why. So my goal in this video series is to help you better understand why you do things, and to use that to outthink others in the games you play. Like I said, my intention in this series is to go into the details of every street in the game of No Limit Hold'em, to help you analyze every option that you have and to make the best decision. You might ask where the preflop section is. While preflop is important, it is the street where someone's edge is definitely the smallest and the fewest mistakes could be made. You're never drawing dead preflop. So because of that, I think postflop is a lot more important, and that players can actually get away with certain preflop leaks if their postflop game is solid, whereas the other way around wouldn't really work. A couple things to remember. Basically, the more you know about your opponent's tendencies, the less equity you require, immediate equity you require in your holding to bluff with, since the total equity is your fold equity plus your immediate equity. So if you have more fold equity, then it's okay that your immediate equity drops, if that makes sense. A couple other things is that every street post-flop, a player is faced with only 4 possible decisions, but these decisions, I guess, aren't as easy as it seems. Decisions are always made not only based upon board texture and the hand you're holding, but most importantly, what you know about the other player. Alright, now moving on to the more important things like actually playing poker. Let's see here. On this slide, I listed a breakdown of the villain's possible action and response combinations against our aggression on any given street. We'll obviously be talking about the flop in the first 2 videos, but these options are available to us and the villain on flop, turn, and river. When we are pre-flop raiser, the villain can donk bet into us with the intention of folding to a raise, calling a raise, or coming over the top with a 3-bet. And when they check to us, they can just check fold, or check call, or check raise us. When the villain is the pre-flop raiser, they can c-bet with the intention of folding to a raise, or calling a raise, or also coming over the top. They can also give up and check fold, or check call their hands, or maybe even check raise. Given that all of these are the possible options for the other player, how do we decide how to respond against each of these actions? In order to do so, we have to anticipate what we think their intentions are, and the more accurately we can do so, the better decisions that we'll make, thereby earning us more money in the long run. When villain leads into hero with intention of folding to the raise, this is the most common response that you'll see in today's games, where people just try to donk bet into the preflop raiser to try to take away the pot. Usually these are just air type hands. Once in a while there'll be really weak hands that can't stand a lot of heat, so they just bet into hero hoping to take down the pot, often without a plan of what to do on later streets. By this logic, obviously the hero should be dealing with the donk bet with using aggression, usually by just raising the flop or maybe floating to try to take the pot away later on later streets. People's ranges for donk betting on different boards vary really widely. There's no easy way to just determine what they do it with exactly, but you could use the hold'em manager statistic, the donk bet statistic, to have an idea of how much someone donk bets into players. I consider anything over 10% a pretty high donk bet percentage, and the more they do it, the more aggressive you should be, because it means their range is wider. However, I still don't think that that stat needs to be taken into consideration fully when trying to decide what to do against a donk bet. When you're unsure of what to do, looking at a statistic might help you, but even when that can't really help you, it's better to respond with aggression and take note of how each player is responding to you. And if the hands get to showdown, take note of what they're showing down and how the hand played out. Whether you raise the flop, they call, and it checks down, then you just see what they have. Or maybe you raise and you barrel off your whole stack and they don't fold. So when they don't fold, take down what they have and use that to make inferences about their play on later street. An example would be if someone were to donk top pair and call their raise on the flop and call every bet after that, then if they were to take a check call line on that same board or a check raise line, it totally eliminates that type of hand from their range. Maybe not totally eliminates, but there's a high possibility they don't play that top pair the same way since they're donking it. Like I said earlier, what you're holding to a degree does matter, but the idea is once you understand what they have in their hand, you can play your hand accordingly, whether you have a bluff or a made hand. Now the next scenario is that the villain donk bets into the hero with the intention of calling a raise. This isn't the most common thing to happen these days at the tables, but I think I do still see it pretty often. The reason regulars do this on these boards today are either to induce a raise, expecting you to raise their donk bet, and so they can call it and collect some money, or that they're just not comfortable with potentially check calling 3 streets against you. The proper response to this, I would say, is to not fold the flop because of the strength of their hand generally. On most board textures that people donk bet on, you'll find that they just don't have the nuts. And most of the time when people don't have the nuts, they're not willing to put in a ton of money. Once again, like I mentioned earlier, there's no formula to determine exactly what hands they do this with and exactly how they're going to respond because everybody's different. The only way to find out is to be aggressive and force them to show down a good hand. Now, you can either raise the flop and barrel off, and I do find that most players fold some point somewhere along the line, or you can float, and if they give up somewhere later, you can take the pot away. Or if they continue to lead into you for all 3 streets, you can actually just call them down and just jam the river because they're not willing to bet call the river with anything but the nuts. And because they never have the nuts taking that line, then they'll be folding all the time. I believe those are the best ways to adjust to the donk betting that happens in today's games. The third scenario is when villains donk bet into heroes with the intention of coming over the top, 3-betting them. I think this line is actually really rare today. You'll find them to be mostly semi-bluffs or very strong hands on wet boards that are very connected and very wet, where we're unlikely to continuation bet, so they want to make sure that we can't check behind, so that we could take free cards to outdraw their big hands or whatever. Once again though, even if these lines can be really strong, it's good to be aggressive against these because people do still lead out with air on scary boards that look like they might come over the top on, but they'll just end up folding anyways. So unless you know for a fact that the villain donk bet 3 bets only with, or donk bets with only the intention of 3-betting, you should raise him until he shows you otherwise. Now, donk betting is something that you will run into on a regular basis, but it's not the most common scenario that occurs when you're the pre-flop raiser and no limit hold'em. I went over the topic because I think that a lot of people aren't necessarily very comfortable in dealing with donk bets, and they can be fairly awkward situations. Um, it's always important to know how to deal with these situations. But in poker, what's even more important is knowing how to deal with situations that come up constantly. Because if you can't make money as well in those spots, then it becomes a lot harder to make money as a whole in the game itself. That said, I'd like to talk about a scenario where we raise, the villain calls our pre-flop raise and checks to us. This is what obviously everybody deals with every time they play. It's very important that not only do you have reads on the villain, and that you always pay attention to the board texture and how the future streets will play out. I know this video is about flop play, but you should always play the flop with a plan for the future streets, like the turn and the river. Thinking about what cards can and will fall, and how that affects your decisions on later streets, and how it affects what you think the villain will do on later streets as well. Moving on. When the villain checks to you with the intention of folding to a bet, it's pretty simple. They basically don't like the hand and are just giving up. One thing about this though is that you should always pay attention, because every villain has a different range of folding to C bets. I just said I wouldn't mention Hold'em Manager stats, but just for example, if you have a player who's folding to 70% of C bets, that's extremely high and extremely rare as well in today's games. But if you see that, it means that, well, if you're C betting and they're folding all the time, then when they do call you, you need to be aware of what they're calling you with and how their range looks. In theory, their range should look much stronger than someone who folds to 30% of C bets, and you would need to adjust your decisions accordingly based on what you know about their folding tendencies. A more common line that you'll see is that villain checking to you so that you can make your continuation bet so that they can call you. Once again, it's really important to note how they respond to C bets. Someone who folds a lot obviously is more likely to have a hand, and a stronger one at that, when they do call you, whereas someone who's constantly calling C bets is just not going to be that strong on later streets. The most difficult situation to deal with is probably the third scenario, when the villain checks to hero with the intention of raising their bet. The reason that most people find this more difficult is because the pot, when raised, pots get big really quickly, and next thing you know, stacks are flying in the middle of the table. In these spots, it's very, very important to note how much people or the villain is folding to C bets, and also how much they raise C bets, because someone who likes to call a lot and doesn't raise a whole lot of C bets, their range for raising is going to look completely different than someone who folds to very few C bets but doesn't flat a lot of C bets and just raises a ton. These reads come about after playing with people for a while and also observing the board textures on which they are raising on and the board textures on which they're flatting. This is very important because, once again, every player's ranges on these different boards vary very widely, and you need to take note of what they're doing, what they show down with, even when you're not in the hand. This is something that happens to a lot of players when they play a lot of tables. They only pay attention to what villains show up with or don't show up with in hands where they face the villain, whereas I think it's very important to notice what they do against other players as well. Not only will you see how they play against different people, you'll also just get more information, and the more information you have on someone, the better you can play against them. So, when villain check raises hero, our possible responses to the villain's check raise would be either 1, to 3-bet or come over the top, or 2 to just call and play a turn or river. If we suspect that someone is bluffing on a dry board where they check raise and it's just a board that like king 4-2 rainbow, it's very hard for someone to actually make a hand because someone's check raising range would consist of mostly sets and maybe a very strong top pair. And it's if someone check raises this board and you don't have a read on them, it's better for you to try to rebluff them by 3-betting or even floating against their raise. I would advise 3-betting because it's a cheaper bluff, and you also don't know the villain's turn tendencies, if they're gonna barrel off the turn and give up the river, or barrel the turn and the river, and that would just be a more expensive lesson basically, because you just don't have any information. If you 3-bet the flop against them, even though the 3-bet itself looks like it's a bluff, you're not going to find that people will just try to come over the top of that without some crazy dynamic. Calling is also good if you know or have better reads on the villain, where you know that they will give up on a later street, or where they're most likely to be bluffing and you can shove over the top of their turn bet or whatever. Then that's obviously a read based thing though, and that's something you want to do once you have a better idea of how your opponent plays. So now that I've spent some time talking about facing flop donk bets and facing flop check raises, I'd like to go over some hand histories with you guys and show you how and why I do certain things in each of these hands. Let me pull one up real quick in the replayer here. Okay, so pre-flop I open with ace-9 from the cutoff, pretty standard. Get called from a regular here that's kind of a strange player. I would call him very straightforward post-flop. He's really loose, or fairly loose pre-flop. C-bets a ton and gives up a lot. Doesn't put in a lot of money without very strong holdings, so someone who's really easy to play against. So I open up here and the flop comes 8-4-2 with 2 diamonds, and he leads out. When he leads out here, like I said, I think most regs here, especially with his half pot sizing, I think it's pretty obvious he has either some sort of weak draw or a very weak made hand here. So I think raising, especially with slightly deeper stacks, makes it really easy to put pressure and force him to fold a lot of his hands on later streets. So I go ahead and raise here, a little over 3 times, and he calls. Turn brings a king of diamonds, which I think is really good. Most of his marginal range, actually all of his marginal range here, is pretty much going to have to fold. If he makes a flush, then he's a player like him is going to show aggression, and because stacks are deep, he's going to raise. He's not just going to slow play a flush and let me keep betting. And if for some reason he does have a random pair plus diamond type hand that chooses to call again, we have some equity with the 9 of diamonds. Not a ton, but it's enough, and I think given that plus the turn card itself makes it a really easy bet. And I go ahead and bet here, and he folds. Moving on to another example of a similar style, basically where I raise the flop and continue on the turn. Well, continuing with that theme, I should say. I open on the button here, get 2 calls, one from a nit and one from just a fairly tight tag-ish regular. The big blind decides to lead out here. And once again, when people lead out here, there's maybe a chance he's leading out with some sort of big flush draw, like a king high or ace high flush draw, and wanting to bet 3-bet. But I also think that's unlikely because it's much easier for them to check, let me bet, let the potential small blind call, and then check raise to collect a bigger pot or build a pot. So I think when they lead here, it really is just marginal hands. Like if they choose to call like a 7-8 or a 7-6 suited type hand, lead out here. Or sometimes people do this with small pairs like 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, or even 8s or 9s. The thing is, when people do that though, their hand still can't stand a lot of pressure because they don't know what range you're responding with by being aggressive in these spots. So I raise, and he calls. The turn is a total brick, and I'm going to elect to keep betting because I think his hand range is weak, and if he's willing to stack off with a marginal hand here, I'm going to make him show me. I'm not going to let him just donk into me, call the flop raise, and get a cheap showdown of any sort. So I elect to bet again, and he folds pretty quickly. Well, the speed of his folds isn't shown in this hand history, but he did fold fairly quickly at the time. In the first two examples, I went over hands where I dealt with the villain's donk bet by raising and being aggressive on the flop, and continuing where I thought necessary on the turn. Now I'd like to show you some where I chose to smooth call the flop to play the future streets a little differently. Let's see. So, make this guy a little bigger here. So in this hand, I don't know how to hide the hand. Let me see. I guess you guys already saw it, but it doesn't matter now. So I open Jack 7 spades on the button, get a call from a small blind, who's just a reg at 50 cents a dollar. Nothing too special about him. I would call him on the slightly looser but still taggy side. Not too out of line, but not a good player by any means. In this spot, he leads out here. If I had pure air, I would be more apt to fold because I don't think that he would lead total garbage out with a 20 big blind stack in front of him. So I definitely just fold something with less potential, but we do have an overcard and a gut shot. So once this big blind folds, I choose not to fold this hand. The turn comes a club, and he checks to me. I think it's a really easy bet. Had he led some sort of flush draw on the flop, he would definitely not check it on the turn. So basically, I removed all clubs from his range. And so I go ahead and bet here, and he calls. Now the river's jack, which sort of not complicates, but changes things a little bit because now I have top pair, which is very often the best hand here. Because I have what I think is the best hand the most often, I mean sometimes I'm going to lose to a weirdly played jack 10 or a jack 8, some type of hand like that if he plays those. However, I still think we're good here a very large percentage of the time, but because of the way the board ran out, it's not the greatest for his range with 3 clubs on the board and a lot of possible, well, some possible straights and 2 pairs for us. Because of that, his range is obviously pretty weak, and I choose to bet a bit smaller, around 2/3 pot, to try to get a call from him. Now, had the board run out a bit differently, I would have changed the size of my bet. If the board ran out a brick, I would have shoved all in um, for $80, which was like a 1.25x pot bet, I believe. Because what happens then is his range is so weak that he won't be able to call there. I mean, it's not to say that he'll never ever call us there, but I think that if I make that type of bluff and he does call, it tells me something about the player. But generally, you'll find that if the board bricks off and you jam there, they're never going to call you because they never have a flush. Um, they might, if he has Jack 10, he might call you there just because they look at their hand and they look at the absolute value and decide they have the highest two pair and just call. But generally, you're folding out close to 100% of their range on the river by just jamming on the river. Um, I think if a queen came, I could bet a little bigger, but I wouldn't need to jam because the queen has a similar effect to the jack right now. But because we want him to fold, we'd still need to bet bigger. Um, so that's what I would have done on a brick. But because we made top pair on the river, I chose to make a smaller bet to try to entice a call from a hand, which, as you saw before I showed, he tabled ace 10 offsuit. In this next hand, I open 4-3 clubs on the button, get a call from a reg who I consider not to be a very strong player, but he's for the most part fairly straightforward, won't put a ton of money in the pot without a very strong holding. He's not very stationary, he doesn't show down a whole lot, but at the same time he also doesn't really fold to c-bets a ton. That said, because he doesn't fold to c-bets a ton but doesn't show down a lot at the same time, it makes me more inclined to apply a lot of aggression on later streets, knowing that he'll fold somewhere. So he leads out on this board, and it's a really dry board, but he leads out into a half stacker, which leads me to believe he probably has some sort of hand. He could easily have a weaker queen here, or even like a fairly strong queen, like maybe king queen. Even though he doesn't 3-bet a whole lot, I'm pretty sure I've seen him 3-bet ace queen from that position, so I'd be more inclined to eliminate that hand from his range. But I think because of the half stack in front of him, he is leading out not total garbage, most likely some sort of weak made hand like a small pair or top pair, and an unlikely 5-7, but I think he's a little tight to be playing that from the small blind. I chose to call because I have bottom pair. It's a little dicey as far as my pair of fours probably isn't good all that often, but knowing that he doesn't show down a lot made it okay for me to call my bottom pair and either make a play on later streets or hit trips or two pair. Of course, that's always nice. I chose to call here and turn a gutter. The bottom end of it though, so I'm not exactly counting on a 5 to make my hand, and he leads out again. And at this point, I think he's leading out a similar range. He could also be leading out a hand like 5s and 8s that is a pair but also has a straight draw with it. I chose to call here for the same reason that he doesn't show down a lot, and if he's leading out some of those pairs and I hit a 5, he checks to me. I can still bet and win the pot by making a straight. If he shows a ton of aggression, despite a 5 hitting, I think it's a pretty easy fold because I just don't think he's gonna go nuts bluffing on a 5 river. So it would be more likely that he has an 8x type hand, or most likely 8s. Given all that, I chose to call the turn again. Now, on this river, it's not the greatest river for me, but he bets out not the biggest amount, and I considered that the only hand that I really thought he could have here was fives, and that he was either going for some thin value with the queen, which is somewhat unlikely, but that he could have easily hit a set of sevens or eights. That said, knowing the way he plays, I decided that he could fold that hand, or he could fold anything but a five. So if he had a pair of fives, that would be the only time I would be losing. So I opted to just shove all in, and he thought for a bit and folded. There's a small chance that he bluffs here, but I think it's pretty unlikely just based on how much I've played with him. As you can see, I have about 3.2k hands on him, and it worked out that time. Even if it didn't work out and he showed up with fives, I think I'd still like my play just because of how narrow his calling range is in that situation. In this hand, I believe I play against Dancing Green, I think. Open here, yeah, and he calls. He's a fairly loose regular that I would consider pretty aggressive, but a bit spazzy. He likes to bluff. Doesn't love to fold in general. That's how I would classify him. So even though his stats look the same as some of the other players that were in the other hand histories, his tendencies are very different, despite very similar numbers like 24-20 VPIP PFR, an 8.6% 3-bet, 75% C-bet, and a near 50% double barrel stat. He looks like a very typical tag reg, but his tendencies are very different from the other players despite having those stats. So he calls in the small blind here and leads out here. I think his lead here can be a number of hands. Can be complete garbage. It could be a weak 7-8, 6-7 suited type hand. He might call those from the small blind. It could be like an ace-3 suited, ace-2 suited type hand as well. It could also just be total air. So I chose to float here. I mean, seems like to me the perfect hand to float with. You have backdoor clubs, 2 overcards. It's really strong to have a hand with that much potential equity. So I chose to call here, and he checks now. Now when he checks here, I think he either has a marginal hand that wants to get to showdown cheaply, or he just has air that he's giving up with and will just check fold. So I opted to make a bet. And then he makes a small raise, which to me looks really fishy. Mostly I would say fishy because when people want to stack off at these limits, they often make a bigger raise, a more committing raise. That said, I had 2 options here. I could have just jammed all in, which I think would have been fine, or I could have called, which is fine as well. I mean, seeing as how I still have a draw to my 10 king or club now. Because of his size, and I thought that I would look fairly strong calling the turn bet, I chose to just call here instead of shoving, but I think shoving would have been fine. Like, even if it was somehow a mistake against his particular holding, it would never be a huge mistake. Just because I don't think that his check raise range includes super netted hands like straights or even sets, just the way he plays. So I opted to call here, and the river pretty much bricks out, and he checks to me. Oh, whoops. Accidentally clicked too far, but he checks to me, and basically at this point I think that I'm pretty sure he just has air. So I opted to make a small bet. I might have made my bet a tiny bit smaller, but sometimes if you make it too small, they try to find a hero call with some sort of ace high type hand. So I wanted to discourage that by making the bet slightly bigger, but still well under half pot, about 37% pot actually. Um, so I went ahead and made that bet, and he folded pretty quickly. So he was just trying to make a play at the pot, and yeah, so he gave that pot away